This moment didn't begin with a treaty or a vote or even a formal declaration. It began with something far more dangerous in geopolitics, a threat that crossed an invisible line. When the President of the United States refused to rule out using force to take Greenland, the Arctic stopped being a quiet strategic backwater and became an active pressure point inside NATO itself. For decades, the Arctic ran on an unspoken rule. The United States dominated militarily. Denmark held sovereignty. Greenland existed in a carefully managed balance between autonomy and alliance. Everyone cooperated. No one challenged borders. No one forced allies to choose. The system worked precisely because it stayed quiet. Then Donald Trump broke it. When talk of buying Greenland evolved into rhetoric that hinted at coercion, the meaning changed overnight. This was no longer an abstract negotiating tactic. It was a NATO power openly treating allied territory as negotiable, and once that happened, the entire Arctic security order cracked. Canada understood immediately what was at stake. If Greenland could be pressured, then Arctic sovereignty itself was no longer secure. Not Denmark's, not Greenland's, and certainly not Canada's, whose Arctic territory stretches across nearly 40% of its landmass. Silence was no longer neutral. Silence became risk. That is why Ottawa did not issue a cautious statement or retreat behind diplomatic language. It moved. Canada made a decision that reshaped the Arctic map without firing a single shot. It announced a permanent Canadian consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. On paper, that might sound bureaucratic. In reality, it was a strategic act. A consulate is not symbolism. It is diplomats, intelligence coordination, security cooperation, and daily presence. It is institutional weight on the ground. By embedding itself in Greenland at the exact moment Washington was applying pressure, Canada transformed the issue from rhetoric into reality. Greenland was no longer an isolated territory facing the world's most powerful military alone. It became a shared sovereignty space backed by another G7 nation. That single move triggered a chain reaction across NATO. Denmark was no longer standing by itself. Europe was no longer watching quietly. What Washington had framed as a bilateral issue instantly became multilateral. The Arctic was no longer operating under American assumption. And that shift mattered, because Greenland is not a symbolic island. It is the hinge point of Arctic power. Spanning more than 2 million square kilometers with just 56,000 people, Greenland cannot be controlled through population or politics. It is controlled through sensors, airspace, sea lanes, and undersea detection. Whoever dominates Greenland controls the movement between North America and Europe. This is why the United States already operates one of its most critical installations there, Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base. Its radar systems feed directly into North American missile defense. It tracks ballistic launches and space activity long before threats reach the continental U.S. That base exists today. It operates today. And it already gives Washington the security access it claims to need. Which raises a dangerous question. If access is already guaranteed, then this push isn't about defense. It's about control. And control, once pursued openly against an ally, changes everything. Canada's move sent a clear signal. Annexation logic would not spread northward without resistance. Ottawa was willing to absorb political cost to stop a precedent that could unravel Arctic sovereignty entirely. Presence replaced patience. Alignment replaced ambiguity. The moment Canada chose to stand beside Denmark and Greenland, the old Arctic order ended. A new one began. One where American power was no longer assumed to be purely protective, and where Allied unity became the primary deterrent. This was no longer about whether the United States could take Greenland. It was about what would happen if it tried. The real danger wasn't that Greenland might change hands. The danger was that the rules governing power inside NATO had quietly shifted. For the first time since the alliance's founding, an American president had framed Allied territory not as something to defend, but as something to acquire. That distinction matters more than it sounds. For 70 years, NATO cohesion rested on one core assumption. U.S. dominance existed to protect smaller allies, not pressure them. Once that assumption cracked, every allied government had to ask the same uncomfortable question. What happens when the strongest member decides restraint no longer applies? Denmark saw the implications immediately. Greenland is a semi-autonomous territory, self-governing in its internal affairs but still reliant on Copenhagen for foreign policy and defense. That arrangement worked because no one challenged it. The moment Washington did, Denmark's sovereignty was no longer theoretical. It was being tested, and Denmark wasn't alone in feeling exposed. Canada's Arctic stretches across millions of square kilometers of sparsely populated territory, much of it indigenous land. If Greenland could be framed as negotiable, Canada's own north could one day face similar pressure, economic, political, or strategic. Arctic sovereignty, once treated as settled, suddenly looked conditional. That's why Canada's response wasn't cautious. It was decisive. Opening a consulate in GIUK was not just about Greenland. It was about signaling that Arctic borders are not suggestions. It placed Canadian diplomats, security coordination, and intelligence visibility directly inside Greenland's political ecosystem. From that moment on, every conversation about Greenland included Ottawa by default. That changed the math in Washington. What had once been framed as a bilateral matter between the United States and Denmark became a collective issue touching NATO unity, European stability, and Arctic governance. Denmark gained a G7 partner on the ground. Greenland gained international backing beyond Copenhagen, and the United States lost its ability to isolate the issue. At the same time, the factual basis for annexation claims began to collapse under scrutiny. The United States already enjoys unrestricted military access to Greenland. Pawtucket Space Base is among the most important early warning installations on Earth. Its sensors monitor ballistic missile launches, space activity, and Arctic airspace in real time. There is no denied access, no hostile presence, no security vacuum. Nothing about Greenland prevents American defense operations. Which is why the argument shifted. Security stopped being the main justification. Resources took its place. Greenland sits on vast deposits of rare earth elements, critical inputs for electric vehicles, advanced batteries, semiconductors, aerospace systems, and modern weapons. As China dominates much of the global rare earth supply chain, Greenland represents one of the few strategic alternatives outside Beijing's reach. On paper, the numbers are staggering. Estimates of Greenland's mineral potential run into the hundreds of billions over time. But here's the catch. Denmark has already invited American participation in resource development. No seizure is required. No sovereignty change is necessary. And extracting those resources remains phenomenally difficult, buried deep beneath ice in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. So again, the logic fails. If access already exists and cooperation is already offered, then ownership becomes about something else entirely. Prestige, control, legacy. That's when European capitals began to speak more openly. Germany, France, and the Nordic states warned that any forced acquisition would strike at NATO's foundation. The concern wasn't just Greenland, it was precedent. If one ally could be pressured into surrendering territory, then the alliance's promise of collective defense would hollow out from the inside. Military analysts were blunt. The United States outspends its allies by an enormous margin. No European coalition could match American force projection in the Arctic on short notice. A direct confrontation would be unwinnable. So allies adjusted strategy. Instead of threatening force, they focused on denial and containment. The goal became simple: make unilateral action politically toxic and operationally impossible. Any move toward Greenland would trigger immediate Allied presence, constant surveillance, and coordinated diplomatic escalation. Power relies on predictability, and once Washington realized pressure produced unity instead of compliance, its leverage began to erode. Greenland stopped looking like an isolated island. It started looking like a tripwire. Arctic didn't militarize in the way many expected. There were no mass troop deployments, no fleet surging north. Instead, something far more effective took shape: total visibility. Greenland's sheer scale makes occupation inefficient. At more than 2 million square kilometers with fewer than 60,000 residents, control doesn't come from boots on the ground. It comes from seeing everything that moves: underwater, on the surface, in the air, and in space. European defense planners pivoted fast. Rather than confronting American power head-on, they built a surveillance-first model designed to eliminate surprise. Persistent monitoring became the deterrent. Maritime patrol aircraft, satellite tracking, undersea sensors, ice-capable patrol vessels, and regular port visits began knitting together a fully illuminated Arctic battlespace. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Any unilateral move toward Greenland would be visible immediately. Every aircraft launch, every naval movement, every logistical buildup would trigger instant alliance awareness and political escalation. The Arctic would no longer offer the ambiguity that great powers rely on to act quickly and quietly. This approach rewrote the power balance. Raw force still mattered, but consequence mattered more. Surveillance turned escalation into exposure, and exposure raised the cost of action far beyond the island itself, into NATO cohesion, global markets, and American credibility. At the same time, Denmark drew its line publicly. Copenhagen made clear that Greenland was not a commodity. It was a people, protected by international law and entitled to self-determination. Selling territory was one thing, selling citizens was another, and that distinction resonated across Europe. Germany expanded its Arctic activity. The United Kingdom and France deepened coordination with Nordic partners. Canada reinforced patrols across its northern approaches. Together, they tightened coverage across the Greenland-Iceland-UK corridor, the GIUK gap, one of the most strategically important maritime choke points in the world. Every modern NATO war plan depends on it. Russian submarines must pass through it to reach the Atlantic. Western reinforcements rely on it in any European conflict, and Greenland anchors the northern gate. Control of that corridor determines who can move forces, who can hide, and who can be detected. That reality explains why the alliance reacted so sharply. What had once been unimaginable became openly discussed: the risk that NATO could be forced to confront its own leader. Analysts warned that a forced seizure would create an impossible choice: accept the annexation of Allied territory or confront the strongest military in the alliance. No one wanted that test, so deterrence shifted away from confrontation and toward cohesion. The Arctic transformed from a permissive environment into a coordinated one. Greenland stopped being isolated by distance and started being surrounded by partnership, and the effect on Washington was immediate. Leverage depends on asymmetry. Once allies demonstrated that pressure would generate unity rather than submission, the cost-benefit equation flipped. Threats stopped functioning as leverage and started functioning as liabilities. Every escalation tightened Allied coordination. Every statement hardened resistance. The more pressure increased, the smaller Washington's room to maneuver became. Greenland's leaders made their position unmistakable. If forced to choose, they would choose Denmark. That declaration mattered. It stripped the issue of ambiguity. This was no longer about negotiation or interest, it was about consent. And without consent, any attempt to change Greenland's status would trigger political fallout far beyond the Arctic. The crisis shifted again. The question was no longer whether the United States could take Greenland. It was whether it could afford what would come next. By the time the crisis reached its peak, Greenland had stopped being the object of pressure and become the center of resistance. Not through force, but through alignment. The Arctic had transformed into a space where every move was watched, every signal amplified, and every escalation carried immediate cost. This is where American leverage finally collapsed. Power depends on optionality, the ability to act without triggering unified response. That option disappeared the moment allies made clear that Greenland would never be isolated again. Any unilateral move would not just confront Denmark or Greenland, but Canada, Europe, and the institutional credibility of NATO itself. The deterrent wasn't a fleet. It wasn't troops. It was consequence. Surveillance sealed it. With satellites, maritime patrol aircraft, undersea sensors, and coordinated Arctic patrols, Greenland became one of the most visible territories on Earth. Surprise vanished, speed vanished, ambiguity vanished. The Arctic became fully lit, and once escalation guarantees exposure, escalation loses its utility. That shift mattered far beyond Greenland. It reshaped how power operates among allies. For decades, NATO relied on American restraint. Now it relied on Allied alignment. Instead of hoping Washington wouldn't push too far, allies made pushing too far strategically irrational. Greenland's leaders understood this reality better than anyone. They stated clearly that the island is not for sale, not now, not ever. And more importantly, they affirmed something that had been quietly assumed but rarely tested, that sovereignty belongs to people, not power. That message echoed across the Arctic. For Canada, standing with Greenland wasn't optional. Canada's own Arctic is vast, sparsely populated, and deeply tied to Indigenous sovereignty. If Greenland could be pressured, so could anyone. Standing aside would have signaled that legitimacy bends under pressure. Standing together sent the opposite message. For Europe, the stakes were existential. If NATO could not defend the sovereignty of its own members from internal coercion, then the alliance's promise meant nothing. Greenland became the line where that promise was tested. And for Washington, the calculus changed completely. Any attempt to force the issue would fracture NATO, undermine American credibility, and hand strategic advantage to rivals watching closely. Russia and China didn't need to challenge the alliance directly. They only needed to observe it unravel from within. That outcome became unacceptable, so the crisis de-escalated, not because the threat worked, but because it didn't. Greenland emerged not as a prize, but as a precedent, a demonstration that even the strongest power has limits when allies refuse to fragment, that coordination beats compliance, that presence beats patience. The Arctic now operates under a new rule. Sovereignty is defended not just by force, but by unity, by visibility, by the certainty that any attempt to redraw borders will trigger immediate collective response. Greenland became the place where American power met its boundary, not through confrontation, but through consequence. And that lesson will shape Arctic geopolitics for decades to come.